Ever feel like you're living in two different worlds?
Right?
Like one where you're a free citizen, but then in the other, you answer to like a mini dictatorship.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of the idea behind private government.
Right.
And that's what we're diving into today
Yeah.
with Elizabeth Anderson's book,
Oh, okay.
Private Government: How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It.
Right.
You've shared some excerpts from it with us.
I have.
Are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, it's a topic that I think is often overlooked,
Yeah,
you know?
right.
We're very quick to point our fingers at the state.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, many of us spend a huge chunk of our lives under the rules and regulations of our employers,
Yeah.
often with very little say.
It's true. And what I found really eye-opening in the book was how this idea of private government at work
Yeah.
really clashes with what like early free market advocates envision.
All right.
It's almost like a historical bait and switch.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's a paradox when thinkers like Adam Smith championed free markets.
Yeah.
They weren't picturing megacorporations calling the shots.
Right.
They envisioned a world of independent artisans and merchants,
Mm-hmm.
all operating on a level playing field.
Yeah.
Like their idea of a free market was actually meant to be a pathway to greater equality,
Right.
not the concentration of power we often see today.
It's a far cry from how we usually think about capitalism now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So where did things go off track? Was it
Yeah.
the Industrial Revolution that shifted the balance?
Yeah.
Exactly. The rise of factories and mass production completely changed the game.
Okay.
Suddenly, it was more efficient to have large numbers of workers under one roof
Right.
answering to a boss instead of being their own boss.
Mm-hmm.
And with that shift came a new kind of power dynamic.
Yeah. And that shift in power dynamics is really what's at the heart of like this whole private government idea.
Right.
It's like we've become so used to the structure of the workplace
Yeah.
that we don't even like question it.
Right.
How much control employers actually have over our lives.
It's a blind spot,
Yeah.
for sure. Because we worry about the government overstepping its bounds. But
Mm-hmm.
how often do we think about the fact that our bosses can dictate everything from when we take a break
Yeah.
to what we're allowed to say,
Right.
even outside of work hours? It's like we're working with this outdated vocabulary
Yeah.
where we talk about like free labor
Right.
and freedom of contract
Yeah.
as if employees and giant corporations have like equal bargaining power.
Uh-huh.
But in reality, that's rarely the case.
Exactly. And Anderson argues that this language actually masks the power imbalance.
Right. Right.
She uses a really powerful analogy in the book to kind of drive this point home.
Okay.
She says that denying employers authority over workers because of freedom of exit
Right.
is like saying that Mussolini wasn't a dictator because Italians could emigrate.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a stark comparison, but
Yeah.
it really makes you think
It does.
about the reality of the situation.
It makes you think.
Yeah.
Just because you can theoretically quit your job doesn't mean you're truly free from your employer's influence.
Yeah, especially if your options are limited or you're worried about like making ends meet or
Yeah, exactly.
providing for your family.
Mm,
All of those factors come into play.
totally. And to illustrate this, she dives into some pretty shocking examples in the book.
She does.
One that really stood out to me was her account of working conditions at Amazon warehouses.
Yeah,
We've all heard the headlines about like worker injuries and stuff.
absolutely.
But her writing really brings those statistics to life.
It does.
You know, like she describes employees being reprimanded for taking a breather,
Mm.
collapsing from heat exhaustion,
Yeah.
even being pressured to sign away their rights if they're injured on the job.
It's awful.
It's rough.
Yeah.
It's like a side of efficiency we don't often see, right? It really exposes that stark reality of this power imbalance.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, are we prioritizing worker well-being and autonomy,
Right?
or are we prioritizing corporate profits and customer satisfaction above all else?
It's a critical question, and it feels
Mm.
especially relevant today.
Yeah,
So knowing all of this, what can we do about it?
right.
If private government is so embedded in our workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
are there ways to create a better balance of power?
That's the question.
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
But she doesn't leave us hanging.
No.
She offers some potential solutions.
Right.
And I think a good starting point is like
Yeah,
just raising awareness, right?
absolutely.
Like we need to acknowledge that this power imbalance exists,
Yeah.
and then we can start to have a real conversation about
Right. Okay. How do we make our workplaces more equitable?
exactly. And then from there, we can start exploring like concrete actions. Like
Right.
what can we actually do
Yeah.
to address this.
What can we do?
And Anderson suggests things like strengthening worker rights,
Okay.
limiting the use of non-compete clauses that can trap people in bad jobs,
Yeah.
and giving employees a more direct voice in how their workplaces are run.
You mentioned non-compete clauses earlier.
I did.
Just for anyone who's not familiar with those.
Yeah.
Those are basically agreements that can prevent you from working for a competitor
Right.
even after you've left a company.
Exactly.
So it's like another way that employers can exert control over your choices,
Exactly.
even outside of work.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
And I think Anderson's point is that the system as it currently is
Right.
often tips the scales too far in favor of employers.
It sounds like she's really advocating for a shift in how we even think about the relationship between like employers and employees.
Absolutely.
Moving away from this top-down model
Yes.
to something that's more collaborative,
Exactly.
more equitable.
Yeah. And it's not just about tweaking a few laws here and there.
Yeah.
It's about examining the underlying assumptions that we have about work,
Okay.
about power,
Yeah.
about freedom itself.
Like whose freedom are we prioritizing?
Exactly. Whose freedom matters more.
Yeah. Is it the freedom of the individual worker to have a say in their work life to pursue opportunities?
To have a decent work-life balance.
Right. To have
Yeah.
a decent work-life balance.
Yeah. Or are we prioritizing the freedom of corporations to maximize profits,
Right.
even if it comes at the expense of worker well-being?
It's a question we don't often ask,
We don't.
but it's a crucial one.
It is.
This whole deep dive has really made me rethink,
Yeah.
like even that traditional narrative of free markets versus government regulation.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not as simple as just like choosing one or the other.
Right.
Maybe the real challenge is how do we balance these different freedoms
It's
in a
true.
way that actually works for everyone.
It's about finding that sweet spot
Right.
where everybody benefits.
Yeah, well said.
And, I think Anderson's book really gives us a framework for having these conversations,
It does.
for thinking about these issues in a new light.
Yeah, by shining a light on these power dynamics that often go unexamined,
Right.
she's encouraging us to really think differently about
Yes.
what it means to be free
Absolutely.
in the 21st century.
Yeah,
It's definitely given us a lot to think about.
it has.
So I guess as we wrap up this deep dive
Yeah.
on private government,
Okay.
what's like the one thing you hope our listeners will take away
That's a good question.
from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is don't take the current system for granted.
Oh, okay.
Question the assumptions
Yeah.
that we make about work, about power, about freedom itself.
Right.
Because it's only by questioning the status quo
Yeah.
that we can begin to imagine and create a more just and equitable future of work.
Beautifully put.
Thank you.
A big thank you to you
And to you.
and to our listeners for joining us on this thought-provoking deep dive.
Absolutely.
We'll see you next time
See you then.
for another exploration of the ideas that shape our world.